If you're just joining us, it is now 11 a.m. on the Pacific Coast in Los Angeles. I am Jonathan Neal. I am the director of the Center for Business and Management of the Arts at Claremont Graduate University. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this first of 8 arts and culture conversations that we'll be hosting this fall. You can find out more about those by registering for them at cgu.edu/events. And you can find out more about the center and our art, business, and arts management programs at cgu.edu/CBMARTS, Arts. And I'll be putting both of those links in the chat box shortly. This conversation is special. Apart from being the first, we are presenting it in partnership with the Museum Studies program of Claremont Graduate University and our School of Arts and Humanities at CGU, as well as with our very cherished colleagues at Bath Spa University in England and the Global Academy of Liberal Arts. Now, before we begin, I'd like to request that everyone please keep your microphones and your video off during the conversation. This is being run as a normal Zoom session, and this will ensure that our speakers remain at the top of your screens and that you only hear and see them regardless of whatever Zoom view you have selected. At this point, most of us are fairly adept at Zoom, but it's always worthwhile reminding you of these things. So please turn off your microphones and turn off your videos if you have not been one of the invited participants. Also, if you have questions for our speakers, we encourage you to do this, but we want those questions in the chat box, and I will be assisting our moderator to field them and make sure that the questions get to where they need to go. Our moderator and the organizer for this session is none other than Laura Zucker, who I will introduce to you now. Laura is the interim head of our arts management program at Claremont Graduate University, a position that she is returning to after having led the program for 6 years, beginning in 2009 to 2015. She's currently a senior associate also with AEA Consulting, where she works on various different cultural and strategy projects globally. But she is, of course, perhaps most well known for serving as the executive director of the Los Angeles County Arts Commission for 25 years between 92 and 2017. So there is no place in Los Angeles that hasn't benefited from Laura's expertise at one point or another. So you can trust that we are all in very good hands. So thank you again for joining us on this first session. And Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This is a fantastic series colloquium. I want to just welcome so many colleagues who I know from across the country, and I'm sure from England and around the globe as well. But I've noticed that we have colleagues, particularly from AAAE, which is our Association of Arts Administration Educators, who I haven't seen in a while, and it's so great to see virtually here. And we have students, I know, current students, we have alumni saying hi to each other. We have so many, and we're going to find out more about who's in the room, who's in the virtual room. There are many students who've actually been involved in CGU's terrific partnership with Bath Spa University. And by the way, for those of us in the United States, as much as we would like to think that this is actually a spa, it's a fantastic university that's located in a fantastic spa town, Bath Spa, which is what distinguishes it. We have Kristen Dorn, who's the interim head of the Bath Business School, who played an instrumental role in conceiving of this and putting it together. And this association between CGU and Bath Spa University is part of GALA, which is the Global Academy of Liberal Arts, an international community of 19 universities managed by a team based at Bath Spa that enhances global understanding through interdisciplinary collaboration in teaching and research. And as part of this, there has been a joint course between CGU and Bath Spa that's happened every June, July for the past several years. Didn't happen this past year for obvious reasons, but we're all hoping it's going to happen next year, in which the students spend a week here in Los Angeles and a week in Bath Spa. And it's a fantastic experience. And I know that we have alumni from this program. And Liam, one of our panelists, is actually an alumni of this program who took the course. In case she's here with us today, I wanted to acknowledge Patricia Easton, our provost, who facilitated this partnership to begin with, and Joshua Good, the Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Chair of the History Department at the School of Arts and Humanities. So this really took a lot of people to pull together, which is super great. We're going to start, Jonathan's going to help me by starting with 3 quick polls for you all, so that we have a sense of where everyone is and who everyone is. So if you would please go ahead and participate in the poll. We'll give people just another minute to look at the choices, some of which you can enter multiples. And then Jonathan will broadcast the results for us all. So we will see who's here. Okay, so most of us are in the United States, although some of us are in the People's Republic of California. Some of us are elsewhere, a nice representation from the UK. I think we're all pretty much agreed that the beaches would be great, or traveling would be super great. And of course, any of the above with friends would be wonderful. Professional roles, majority students joining us today, 40%, but we've got a good showing of teachers, arts administrators, arts entrepreneurs, artists, arts consultants. One funder, I think that's maybe me. I sit on the board of a foundation. Okay. So this is who we are. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing that. I'm going to start by hopefully giving us some quick context. I'm going to share my screen. And this is 2 pie charts with the revenue sources. The one, as you're facing it on your right-hand side, that's not labeled is the United States. And that's a chart from Americans for the Arts that divides out sources of support. Both of these charts are from the same year, 2017, so they're pre-pandemic. The other chart on the left is one I put together from information from the Arts Council of England in terms of support for those organizations funded by the Arts Council, so that's an important caveat. If you may notice that they're slightly askew because despite how technically advanced I am, I cut and pasted these together with Scotch tape. And so, and then scan them. So that's why they're slightly askew. But a few quick points. So these are pre-pandemic, 2017. If you notice, and I think this is key, there is roughly the same amount of earned income on average from arts organizations in both England and the United States. Slightly more currently in the United States, but it is still, 54 to 60%. So when we're talking about pandemic impacts, earned income is going to be equally impacted in both sectors. The primary difference in these pie charts, and those of you who have participated in the joint CGU Bath Spa course will know that these are my favorite pie charts, because in order to understand what's happening in our 2 countries, we really have to understand the underlying business model in terms of sources of revenue. The other largest wedge besides earned income here in England is the Arts Council subsidy, which is almost a quarter of organizations' income. This same amount in the United States is made up predominantly of contributions from individuals, as well as some from corporations and foundations. So these are equivalent, except that one is government and the other comes from the private sector. The amount in the United States coming from local, state, and federal government together is less than the contributed income coming from the private sector in England. And I think that this is very important context for our discussion, because although there's the same reliance on earned income, larger government support in England makes the actions of government that the actions that government takes even more important, yes? And the Fabian report, which Adrian Ellis from AEA Consulting kindly sent me earlier, and the Fabian report is the oldest left-leaning think tank in England that just came out in August 2020, identified continuing government cutbacks that preceded the pandemic. So again, for context, England had been progressively cutting back public support for the arts over a period of a decade before we hit the pandemic. But the question becomes in the United States, how and if individual philanthropy and other sources of philanthropy are going to be stepping up during this time. Ironically, we're in a time where the stock market and investments are doing incredibly well. This could be a bubble that could burst at any moment, but this is a significant difference in the United States from the 2008 recession, in which private philanthropy was as hard hit, if not as harder hit, than organizations, and what happened with private philanthropy cascaded to organizations. So I'm going to stop sharing this now, and I don't know, Jonathan, if as you're monitoring, if there's anybody who had any particular questions about the context before we proceed, or they'll continue to come up.
Not yet, so we'll field the questions as they come in.
Fabulous. So you have the bios from our 4 terrific participants who are our panelists today, 2 from the UK and 2 from the United States. So I'm not going to read bios, but I wanted to help to welcome starting off Camilla Johns, who's head of development at the Holborn Museum in Bath, to give us a sense of what the impacts have been.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone from Bath in the UK. So my name's Camilla and I'm at the Holborn Museum in Bath. So we're a historic art museum. We were founded as Bath's first public art gallery in 1882. And it's quite interesting seeing those pie charts, because the Holborn Museum is a completely independent museum and we receive no government support either locally or centrally. So the COVID crisis and lockdown has had a significant impact on us, as it has with many, many other organisations in the UK, but also across the world. And I think there's a couple of things, just going back to those diagrams, that are worth talking about in relation to organisations across the UK. And the first key thing is that not all arts organisations in the UK are supported by the Arts Council. And actually, in the case of the Holborn Museum, although our earned income is around 56%, the remainder is from fundraising. So it's put a significant pressure on, having lost visitor income, it's put a significant pressure on raising money from individuals and trusts and foundations in a way that we've never seen before. So it's been a very interesting few months, but I am a believer in opportunity. And I think one of the things that we're taking away from this is that we're all in it together. And there are opportunities to be more dynamic and to be more open about the need of our sector we're finding that although the UK, I think most people recognise that in terms of individual giving, we are not quite as successful as the US is, for all sorts of reasons up for discussion. But we're finding that never, like never before, people are being so generous and supportive of our museum and other cultural institutions all over the place. So there are some positives, but also the government and the Arts Council and a number of other funders have been incredibly open and transparent and reactive to all of us. So it's been, like everywhere, a very, very difficult few months, but we're all working together to kind of try and find solutions and to plan for the future.
And is the museum open?
We are open, which is a huge relief, and we're delighted. We were one of the first museums in the country to reopen in July, because we have the luxury of a one-way system that we can implement. But we have restrictions on visitor numbers, but they are slowly regrowing.
Well, you're ahead of us then, because our museums are not yet open. So thank you very much for that perspective, and for reminding us that as much as it's great to look at what averages are of sources of income, every organization is individual and has individual challenges. So Liam is the Museum Relationship Manager for the Arts Council of England. What's going on?
Oh, yeah. Well, what's going on? A bit of an understatement at the moment. Obviously, for us, the last few months have been a bit of a whirlwind, just trying to, react to the situation. Obviously, it's been a massive challenge for a number of arts organisations. What we've tried to do is be there as a support mechanism. So make sure that we can get funding out as quickly as possible to different organisations across our portfolio of organisations that we regularly fund, as well as organisations that we either haven't funded before or fund for small short-term projects, essentially. So it's been very busy, and I've assessed more applications than I think I've ever done in my time at Arts Council during this period. Just to give you a snapshot, we initially had an emergency response fund, which we basically used up a massive amount of our budget, investing £64.8 million in 9,666 people and organisations, and then £33 million to our national portfolio organisations, which are the ones that we regularly fund anyway. So we initially tried to respond to the situation with that. Obviously, that's not enough, because there are so many more arts organisations that we didn't reach through that first round. So then the government has responded with us for this new round of funding called the Cultural Recovery Fund. And this is ongoing. And this is up to £500 million. The arts organisations can apply from 50,000 up to £3 million. And if they want to apply for any more than 3 million, they have to apply for a loan, which essentially, obviously, they'll have to pay back to the government. But it's a small-term loan with a small level of interest. So shouldn't be too difficult. But those are for the massive arts organisations that are struggling, like the South Bank Centre or National Portrait Gallery in London. Yeah, so a lot of it has been reacting to the current situation, but I think we've been able to help a huge number of arts organisations and also individual artists through the Emergency Recovery Fund, and also our Developing Your Creative Practice Fund, which is for artists or cultural workers to improve their sets of skills and take some time out, some funded time out to experiment with what they want to do next.
Great, thanks for that overview. How forthcoming or resistant would you say the government has been about the additional support money?
I think the first thing I would say is this is not like a normal fund that we would create, let's say. I think this, the money that we've got from the government for the Cultural Recovery Fund, the way that the grants are processed is very different to how we would normally do this. We have a strong impetus to include diversity and inclusion within all of our work. And that is not being such an important factor here, because this is coming directly from the government, not from us. So it's basically a government pot of money that they set the terms, they set the applications, and we just administer it essentially. So yeah, I think the government were forthcoming enough to obviously give us the money, but it took a good couple of months of ironing out the actual details of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that some of the most pressing issues of our time are going out the window, but it's an emergency. So next up, we're going to hear from Jeffrey Herr, who's curator emeritus of Hollyhock House and Simon Rodea's Towers in Watts Towers, who worked for many, many years for the City Cultural Affairs Department. Jeffrey.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's good to be here. And I had to identify with Camilla when she was talking about her sources of funding and how her institution falls outside the pie chart, because Hollyhock House falls outside that pie chart too, where our situation there is that we are administrated by the Department of Cultural Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. And that department's budget is an annual appropriation from the City Council. And the real kicker here is that that budget is based on a percentage of the transient occupancy tax, or a hotel bed tax. This year, that revenue stream for the city is down 98%. So you can see that coming up in the next budget talks, there's going to be very, very little leeway for supplying the Department of Cultural Affairs with funds to continue running their programming. So that's the baseline funding for Hollyhock House, which includes salaries, maintenance, all of the utilities and the things that it takes to keep a cultural institution running. We also have revenue from visitorship, and that is completely wiped out. There are no visitors, and we're probably not going to have any visitors the rest of this year, and it's it's unclear how soon the city will allow Hollyhock House to reopen. So again, funding is a real problem, partly because, again, with the city budget crises, there's been a hiring freeze. There has also even been a contract freeze. So things as basic as keeping the lawn mowed and the trees trimmed and just the basic grounds goes into some sort of an emergency mode in order to fund that. It's something that we just weren't prepared for, and I think we're probably all in the same boat there. But this kind of crisis situation for a municipally funded cultural institution where your revenues are dependent on a variety and a very unstable primary source presents a challenge.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point. Everything that's focused on emergency preparedness in the cultural sector so far, and there has been a rather robust focus on that within the past decade or so, has focused on isolated events like Hurricane Katrina, things that shut down a community for a very small defined period of time where everyone is dealing with the same crisis and needs to respond to it. But nobody anticipated anything like this. And I wonder how this is going to change our thinking about crisis management going forward. I think is going to be a really interesting question to explore. So Julie Baker, who's executive director of Californians for the Arts, and who I also just want to say is walking the walk, not just talking the talk, because she is running for her local school board in Northern California. So grateful that you're coming to us, being only 50 miles from the closest fire that's happening.
Yeah, welcome.
So you're in the middle of the
realities.
wildfires as you are with us,
Yeah.
but give us your perspective.
Sure. Well, thank you. And I appreciate being here. So quickly, what I do is I run the statewide advocacy organization for arts and culture, and actually is now starting to include entertainment in the for-profit sector, and I'll talk about that in a second. I also am the state captain to Americans for the Arts, and so I have a picture on the federal landscape as well. I'm going to try and give a quick, because it's supposed to be 3 minutes, overview on both.
Well, you can have 4 if you need it.
Well, let's see. So here we go. So let's start with the COVID impact, which I think I'm just going to give you some numbers. So 2/3 of artists are unemployed in the United States, according to Americans for the Arts. The Brookings Institute, which I'll put in the chat box, just did their study in August for what's happening since the pandemic to now. And there's a loss, they say, of total of 2.7 million jobs in the creative industries, and that's more than $150 billion loss in sales. The fine and performing arts industry is going to be hit the hardest, has been, with 1.4 million jobs lost and $42.5 billion in sales in loss. Of the 50 states, California will be hit the hardest, and that's where my world comes in. The numbers for us, for the arts and entertainment industry, so it's for-profit and nonprofit, is that we've lost, since March through August 1st, 453,000 jobs and $43.1 billion in revenue loss. This is massive, massive impact. As you saw on those pie charts, you know, there is it's almost impossible for the fine and performing arts to earn revenue at this time. And the outlook is 12 to 18 months. I don't know any industry that can survive 12 to 18 months being shut down. So the need for public and private support is huge. Just to give you an idea of how we do it here in the US, different than how you're doing it in England. We don't have a minister of culture. We don't have anyone in the cabinet. We have the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. And what happened in March, on March 27th, Congress came together and put together the CARES Act. The CARES Act was a $2.22 trillion package. To put that into perspective, the federal government's annual budget is $3 trillion. So this was a huge emergency relief package. In terms of the arts spending, $75 million went to the National Endowment for the Arts, $15 million went to IMLS, which is Museum and Library Studies, and $75 million went to the National Endowment for Humanities. And just also to put in perspective, the annual budget for the National Endowment for the Arts, which is our sort of way that we give out grants throughout the United States for arts and culture, is about $162 million for the year. Per capita, that's about 49 cents per person in the United States we're spending, public spending on the arts. Okay, now let's get into how we also do it. The other way that the United States has tried to do this is to preserve jobs. They put together something called PPP loans, Payroll Protection Program. There were about 5 million loans in total. 173,000 of those loans went to arts and creative businesses worth $13.7 billion. In total of that, 9,917 went to nonprofit arts and 163,000 went to for-profit arts. You know, in England, I think it was almost $2 billion was put to arts and culture through the government. In our country, the way that we did that was mostly through PPP loans, and specifically $1.9 billion went to arts and culture nonprofits in the state in the United States. But the problem with those PPP loans is that it only dealt with payroll primarily. 75% of it is a forgivable loan if you use it for payroll. But if your organization, your business, or whatever it is totally shut down, that really doesn't help solve the problem. The other problem is dependent upon relationships with banks. And what we know in the United States also is that traditionally, unfortunately, BIPOC communities may not have those types of relationships.
Would
so
you explain BIPOC in case people don't know what it means?
apologies, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and communities that have traditionally been under-resourced don't have those relationships with banks. They may not even have a bank in their communities. And so that has been, an analysis has shown that that's who did not receive the loans, in fact. So then in May, the House in the United States, headed up by Nancy Pelosi from California, introduced the HEROES Act. That was another $3 trillion relief fund. It passed the House, but then you also have to pass the Senate. It didn't. They introduced in July about $1 trillion relief package. They're basically in negotiations. Nothing's going anywhere. So we all sit and continue to wait. So nothing more has come in relief from the federal government since March 27th to address 6 months of businesses being shut down. We also got pandemic unemployment assistance, which was good for cultural workers in the United States who traditionally had not had access to unemployment before. You had to be an employee. Many people in the arts arena are independent contractors. So for the first time, the federal government set up systems to be able to access unemployment for people who are independent contractors. So where are we now in the state of California as well is that CARES Act funding from March from the federal government goes also to the states. Each state then determines how they use it. There's very specific requirements, but some of them sent it out to cities and counties. And that's what California did. California is also the 5th largest economy in the world, is 40 million people. It's a large country, really. So what we did here is that they spread it out into cities and counties. What we've been tracking at Californians for the Arts is about over $50 million in CARES Act funding in the state of California has gone directly to arts and culture. City of Los Angeles is right now trying to get, I think, $20 million pot for that. And in the county of Los Angeles, there's been 10 million. City of Sacramento, for example, is about 20 million. So that's what we see here. There is no other statewide in California mechanism for funding, relief funding, any kind of funding for the arts except for our state arts agency, and that is the California Arts Council. Their annual budget is $26 million. With 40 million people in the state of California, that's about 66 cents per person. So again, we're not really investing from the public standpoint in the arts, both in the state nor at the federal level, as you do, for example, in England. In fact, I think it was Liam who said the government has been reactive, or it was Camilla. No, now you messed me up.
I'm sorry. Camilla.
I grew up with Camilla. I should remember that. Sorry. Who's that the government has been reactive and responsive to arts and culture. I would not say that that is true necessarily in the United States. Our president has actually every year tried to eliminate the National Endowment Arts budget. Every state has a different perspective on how they support arts and culture. Our state, Governor Newsom, is very supportive, but he's dealing with a public health crisis and now a wildfire crisis and $54 billion deficit. So where are we now? One of the, I think, identified problems is that we do not actually have a unified public message around arts and culture in the United States. We've seen a lot of different messaging campaigns pop up. Be an Arts Hero is one. I'm an arts worker. Save our stages. Red Alert Restart. We do our artists, our second responders, but nobody's really come together in a unified fashion as maybe you have in England that I've been watching as well. We are, as you said, more dependent upon private and corporate support, which in a time period where maybe right now the stock market's up, but there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a mass unemployment, that's a slippery slope in terms of how can our arts organizations, arts and cultural workers continue to thrive, survive, and be employed and get through this. I think the opportunity right now that I'm seeing, at least here in California and hopefully at the statewide level, is that we can truly join together and represent ourselves as a creative economy and creative industries. A lot of times we've been very separated, even within the arts and nonprofit sector. We're large budget organizations, we're small budget organizations, but for the first time, I think everyone is in the same boat, and we really can recognize that we are in this together and support each other and come together with a unified message, both to public and private funders, to say, we are workers, we contribute massively, not only to the economy, but also to social impact. And we need to be valued and recognized for that work for the first time, hopefully, in the United States at this point in time. And we should be invested in. So that's the hope right now. And there's a lot of also strategies around a WPA, the Works Project Administration, for the 21st century. How do we create work for arts and culture workers while we are in a shutdown mode? And there's a lot of interesting and really creative strategies around that you're seeing throughout both California as well as all throughout the United States. So hopefully that kind of gives a good overview of what's happening here in California and the US.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that summary. You know, the irony is because support for the arts has never been strong in the United States, nearly as strong as it has been on the UK, in a way we haven't expected much. And whatever we get is like, wow, that's fantastic. So we're super reliant now on individual, foundation, and corporate philanthropy to step forward. And so far, that seems to be happening in the United States. But how much that will continue to happen, particularly given the pressing other causes that are being created via this health emergency. And of course, as we mentioned before, the stock market holding up. So I think that puts the UK folks in an even more difficult position, who are still trying to really develop a culture of personal philanthropy and private philanthropy, which is still significantly less developed than in the United States. So that also leads into what we started to talk about before that I want to re-tee up, Liam, which is the disproportionate amount of funding that we know is going to urban areas, both in the United States and the UK. We have a system that rewards organizations proportionately to their budget. Our largest budget organizations are in urban centers. A lot of our funders are in urban centers. And so, Julie, of course, you're nodding vigorously because this affects California, which has tremendous suburban and rural areas that are traditionally underfunded, now even caught shorter. And what is the situation about this in England? The Fabian report mentions this disparity. What's your perspective, Liam?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, yeah, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, currently the way things are, the majority of funding does go to cities and urban areas. But one of the things we've been trying to do to balance this at the Arts Council is to give anyone with a relationship manager job a role to go out to certain areas, what we call areas of low engagement, which are areas that receive less funding or less opportunity from the Arts Council. And we go there and we have a remit and a role to actively encourage people to apply for our grant funding, to help build up the artistic infrastructure of the area and work with local councils and local authorities in order to actually create a better cultural economy in the area. So, for example, one of the things I've been doing recently is working in an area of Cambridgeshire called Fenland, which is an area of the country that has one of the lowest literacy rates and things like that. So it's quite deprived in a lot of ways. And what I've been doing there is working with the local district council to enable a cultural strategy to be delivered for the area, which will help identify opportunities for activity and funded projects that they can do, and to help them build up infrastructure within their own local authority, but also within the arts ecology of the area, to make sure that artists and creative individuals and organizations are aware of each other, that they can identify opportunities to work together, and if appropriate, come together to deliver funded opportunities. So one of the challenges that we've had, and I've noticed since going out there and starting to do that work, obviously this was all pre-pandemic, was that a lot of people didn't even know Arts Council existed or that Arts Council was for them. We will fund any artistic project as long as it meets our goals and requirements, but a lot of people don't either have the confidence or the knowledge or the ambition to think that they're worth Arts Council funding, and that's a real issue that we've got to face as an organisation, that a lot of people still see the Arts Council as somewhat elitist, even though the idea of the Arts Council is to make art available and accessible to anyone. So that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing at the moment, but it's through that the most interesting work at the moment is actually happening. And we're very keen to really, really support that and make sure that our funding can get out to as many different people as possible.
And Julie, do you want to kind of circle back on this? Because I know this is an issue you've been involved in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think if you see that from the state arts agency's perspective here, the California Arts Council, they've actually done a tremendous amount of work trying to get into communities that traditionally, I think the way that Liam described it, where they don't even see themselves in that mode of being able to access that kind of funding, and that it's only for certain groups. But they've really tried to transition it and really with a racial equity framework and lens on it to make sure that they are reaching communities that are under-resourced, that have not been served before. California is a challenge in that most of our funding, if we are dependent upon corporate, for example, and private foundations, those are not in our rural communities, and they only give regionally, sometimes only to a specific urban area. So you might even have funding in Los Angeles and the neighboring county can't even get access to that, and that becomes is more like a rural community. So it's a challenge for us when our state arts agency only has $26 million. That may sound like a lot to some, but it's really such a small amount of money for so many artists and arts organizations in our state. So yeah, it's something that we do continue to work on to try and figure out where we can find a mechanism to create a public and private partnership for statewide funding for the arts in California.
And I think that this is intrinsically a bigger challenge in the United States, because where government funding, Liam, can at least attempt to address inequities, and certainly that's a key job, right? It's basically the redistribution of taxpayer dollars. When you're really reliant on private philanthropy, people want to fund organizations they know, that are where they live, that's where they attend. And corporations are tying dollars to marketing efforts. So if there aren't a lot of people to buy the products, they're not going to see that as a worthwhile place to invest. And foundations, which are very often centered in large urban centers, usually restrict their area of giving, again, somewhat to where they are. So I think the solution to this is going to be a bit more challenging in the United States. Now, another common challenge that I would really like to hear us reflect on, and Camilla, you may be able to help with this, is we've heard a lot about the digital divide that's happening in the education world. There are people who just don't have the capacity to learn at home because they don't have the equipment, they don't have the internet connections, but there's a very serious digital divide that I think we're already seeing that is going to have long-term ramifications for our arts organizations, because the organizations that began to invest early and substantially in digital and technological relationships with their audience are now able to build on those progressively, and I think are pivoting faster and recovering faster than those that have not. And what are going to be the long-term ramifications of the digital divide for the cultural sector? And Camilla, and then maybe Jeffrey, if you would reflect on that.
Sure. I mean, I guess to start, one of the good things is that this situation has sped up all of our learning around digital. So we have a funder here, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who has brought forward a whole new digital scheme for heritage, supporting, you know, the most tiny of museums in the UK to really upskill, you know, much quicker than they would have been doing otherwise. So there are resources that are coming out of the woodwork quickly to support organisations of all shapes and sizes and capacity to learn and to grow digitally. But yes, you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing to think about is those who are, you know, visitors, audiences, donors who are not also accessing digitally. And for us, you know, in going back to fundraising, there are, you know, many of our donors are online, but there are a few who are not. and visiting our museum or going to a performance was their family and their highlight of the week. And it's how we react and adapt to keep in touch with those audiences who are not able to access digitally. So it is a concern, and I think also we have digital fatigue sometimes. Not only us working in the sector, but people who are dipping into the world of online performances, and so I think it's a very, very fast learning curve. But I think just with everything else, whether it's digital or business planning or adapting performances to be online, we're learning as we go. And I just think we have to be aware of these things and evaluate it all the time.
So Jeffrey, government has been incredibly behind usually the digital curve, and working with a government agency at 2 facilities that probably did not have a huge online presence beforehand. Prognosis?
Well, I guess in this particular sense, maybe Hollyhock House is ahead of that curve. We had done, this is about almost a year before the pandemic, created what we called a virtual accessibility experience, which was a way to allow people either with disabilities or people who were far distant and would never be visiting Los Angeles to tour Hollyhock House. So that has been a huge help in bridging this programming chasm, if you will. When you can't have visitors on site, how do you remain relevant, at least in as relevant as possible? But there's a bigger issue here because we still don't know what the new normal is going to be. And I think we can posit that it's going to involve a lot more digital programming, a lot more digital access than it ever did before. The pandemic has really pushed us there. Where I find an interesting problem that I have been talking to other colleagues about, especially those that deal with architecture. How do you present architecture? How do you keep architecture relevant in a two-dimensional format, even the most sophisticated 3D two-dimensional format? And when people can't visit and actually experience it, where does it begin to lose its punch? Where does it begin to lose its relevance? And this goes all the way to even with a name like Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright's career had its ups and downs, and it's had a recently long run of being up. And but my colleagues who are part of the UNESCO World Heritage list inscription, a lot of them were just getting ready to do major inscription ceremonies, a lot of things, and the pandemic shut it down. They're thinking about, in terms of next year, will it mean anything to anybody? And just one kind of curious note that just happened last week. A man named Victor Cusack, who was an architect and the last surviving apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin, died at 104. And I contacted the LA Times, sent them a lot of information, because I thought this would have some kind of relevant interest to the general public. And their response was basically, his impact on Los Angeles just doesn't warrant his a bio kind of obit in that sense. So I think we're going to be running into a lot of challenges, and one of the tools is going to be digital, but I don't think we dare try to put all our eggs in that particular basket.
No, I think you're right. Yes, Julie.
Can I just quickly add on to the
Yes.
digital divide? I mean, one problem in our state in particular is access to broadband. So because we have so many rural communities, it's tremendous, and we see this particularly in education right now, which is kids doing what we're calling here distance learning, and they don't even have access to the tools to be able to get online. Maybe not even that sort of thing. So the other interesting part that I've seen, in particular with the arts, is that the ability to actually expand your audience, because now you're presenting online, is one of the good opportunities. The challenge is, how do we monetize that? How do we shift people to actually thinking that they should pay for that when it's not what they expect? It's not the same as being spit on from the stage. They don't get that same excitement, so to speak, of the excitement of being in live performance. But there's value in it, and it helps to keep people employed. And the final thing in here in California that's a challenge also is some theaters in some counties, because we have the state that determines public health, but we also have counties that determine public health. Some are allowing us to do live streaming and some are not. So in other words, some theaters can go in and put everyone's socially distanced on the stage and record the live band or a theater or a dance production, and some are not even able to do that yet. So
well, yes. So even those that were more digitally prepared have been caught somewhat off guard by the new restrictions and the monetization. I think that one of the lessons here is, just like I always say, that organizations are more stable when they have a wide variety of income streams, because if one leg gets kicked out from under you, you've got others to stand on. In the same way, I think we're going to be looking at multiple delivery systems and using that to be more stable, so that this reliance on just solely having people face to face or in contact with each other, but having multiple options for interaction, is going to be, I think, an important new trend for the field. So Adrian Ellis, who has offices in both the United States and the UK and who works globally with arts organizations, unfortunately had to leave us, but he sent me a long email with the things that he would have wanted to say. And one of them that I think is very interesting, that I hadn't thought about, is that he feels objectively the UK and the US are the same in terms of their response to this public health policy issue, which has not been great. And these are his words. We have to acknowledge that the incompetence and dishonesty of our respective national governments is affecting the way it plays out, and that it is different in many other countries, and that it didn't have to be this way. He said that objectively, the UK and the US are in a policy vacuum, quite unlike some other countries, and he just came back from 2 months in Italy, and no real end in sight, as trust is eroded and therefore behavioral impact. Well, I hadn't thought of us as being in the same horrible boat together. Do you think that's true? What's your perspective, Camilla and Liam, from being closer to what's happening in countries in Europe?
Just from my side, I think there's just been a lot of confusion and mixed messaging about on a personal level, organizational level, about what to do, and it changes a lot, and it's changing every day. So I think for us as organizations, while we're trying to adapt and change what we're doing and try and plan in some way for the future, it's incredibly difficult. And we can only really go on what we hear from the government and what we read in the news, and it seems to be different. Every country seems to be different. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So, but just in the UK, it changes all the time. So, as it does for everyone.
We've been finding that in the US as well. Liam, is this your perception as well?
Absolutely. I think I'd go so far as to say I'd say our performance by our government has been shocking. It's been terrible. Depending on where you go, which news outlets you look at, We know that our death toll is anywhere between 50 and 60,000, but I think it's on the higher end, close to 60,000. So, but you can't get a straight answer from anyone about anything about the actual, so we don't even really know. And things do keep changing every other day. And that has caused mass confusion. It's caused mass concern, mass upset. We still don't know whether people will start to be evicted when the furlough scheme ends in October, and people might lose their houses. We don't know what's going to happen with that. There's a whole number of unknowns with the situation. Plus, we've been going through the double whammy of the joys of Brexit as well, which, again, we still don't know what's going to happen in the last few days. It seems like the talks are potentially going to fall over and just be non-existent. So it's a really dangerous time for us at the moment, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the political implications of what might happen with our future relationship or not relationship with the EU.
So we have a similar precarious political situation now with a major election coming up. We have the same situation, I think, fundamentally, in that there has been a lack of consistent, coordinated messaging for us nationally. Originally, everything was passed to the states to deal with, and then it's passed even further to the county health authorities to make individual decisions. And I think we have all existed in that same kind of, it feels like being in a washing machine of information, and just trying to all keep our heads above water of what that's happening. So on that encouraging note, I want to say something actually that is encouraging, because I believe that the cultural sector is fundamentally, in many ways, the nonprofit cultural sector particularly, more equipped to deal with issues of uncertainty and confusion than almost any sector. In a way, even when things are good, right? We have to deal with complex and difficult process. That's really what we do for a living. When you think of the rehearsal process, when you think about curating and putting up an exhibition, when you think about any of this, it's solving problems, many of which are unknown, many of which crop up at the last minute, whether it's being hacked on a webinar or the electricity going out and finishing the show with flashlights. This is something that in some ways is baked into our DNA. And I'm wondering if there are things that we as cultural strategists and creative strategists can and should be doing to not only help our sector move forward in this confusing time, but to help others. So that's one thought I want to put out there. And Julie, I'm going to call on you. And then the second part that's related is, it seems to me that this highlights the importance of our own institutions acting in a way with consistent messaging that helps to reinsure our constituents that, unlike what is happening in the larger universe, we can create an island of relationship stability for them, and how we would manifest that. Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that absolutely, I think, the arts and culture sector, and those of us who put on shows and festivals and all the other things that we've done in our lives, understand that you have to be nimble, and things happen, and all of a sudden you shift, and lights go out and you find some flashlights, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think that right now, the real attention is on a public health crisis. That's number one. I mean, everything else is a domino effect from the public health crisis. However you determine if it's been poorly handled or not, and I agree, I think it has been poorly handled in the United States. That's what we have to manage first in order to get back into our buildings. We can never even do our business until that's managed. So I think where arts and culture can fit in, and what we've been advocating for, which also helps to create jobs, is use us in service to public health. And in particular, use us in service to public health messaging. Artists and arts organizations are the cultural connectors in their communities. And artists are the best communicators we have. They are the ones who know how to do it in a way that is maybe going to be much more impactful than a mayor or a public health official telling you to do something. But if it's someone you trust in your community that does it in a creative and innovative way, that might actually change your behavior. And right now we actually have to have massive behavioral change. We need to wear a mask when we go outside. We have to socially distance. We can't get to, all of those things. And it's unnatural. It doesn't feel right. And there's a lot of people in our country and in the county I live in that start to doubt that it's true because the government's telling them that. So we really need, I think the arts and culture sector has a role to play here that could be really impactful and can also create jobs. So I see contracts that should be going to artists and arts organizations.
Okay, I agree with that. So I think we're kind of in our wrap-up phase now. And Camilla, did you want to chime in on this?
I just wanted to add something really quickly, which is just a word that Jeffrey used earlier, which is the word relevance. And I think, we have an opportunity to talk about what we do or to shape what we do to fit that health crisis. And that word relevance is how we talk about ourselves, how we communicate to the government, how we communicate to our audiences, how we communicate to donors, and staying relevant, month on month, and changing what we do and raising awareness of the value of arts and culture to people's lives. And we all try and do that normally, but it's kind of never been more important. And we all believe in the power of art and creativity to support health and well-being, but we really have to show that now. And that's kind of the way, one of the ways forward.
Thank you. I think that's really important. Jeffrey, any last words?
Yeah, I've had some really deep conversations over the last 30 days with colleagues, and the thing that surprised me, and I'm sort of ashamed that it surprised me, but is just how every last one of them said, basically, this is an opportunity. And I think that's our takeaway here, is that we have a challenge. We have multiple challenges, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but the people I've spoken with here think this is a way to make a difference, and it's our opportunity. Let's use it in that way. And I have to agree with them.
Thank you. And that certainly seems to be what you're doing, Liam.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, one of the most interesting things that we're wanting to see now is how people are responding to the situation through using our grants, because the funding is there for people to use it as they think appropriate. Obviously, a lot of people are using it just to get by and keep their organizations afloat. But there are some really interesting bits of activity that are coming out of there as well, and responses to both the COVID situation, but also the worldwide conversations about race because of Black Lives Matter, and a whole host of other societal issues. So it's a difficult time in many ways, but it's a really interesting time as well to see how arts and culture can fit into that.
Well, maybe we'll have an opportunity. There's so much more we could have talked about. I hate to think about how long our current situation may be extending, but whether it extends into the spring or we're starting to be in recovery by the spring, it might be wonderful to really come back together and get a sense of where we've come in 6 months from now and where things are going. So I can't thank the four of you enough for being with us today, for taking on all the challenges that you're taking on in the trenches. Keep up the fantastic work, and I look forward to hearing from all of you in the future. Jonathan?
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I just want to reiterate that this was a fantastic conversation, challenges notwithstanding, either technical or otherwise. We want to say thank you to our colleagues and our partners at Bath Spa, and everyone at Gala, and to Josh and the team at Museum Studies and the School of Arts and Humanities at CGU, And we really appreciate everybody making the effort and your time and your intelligence today. And Laura, thank you very much for forever your composure on screen and on stage when dealing with relatively difficult scenarios.
The benefit of being in theater.
It's good training. Thank you, everybody.